respond, but I choose this morning to lift up my hands and worship you and honor you because you are worthy to be praised. And I'm going to worship you and I'm going to praise you. And I'm going to bring a sacrifice of praise this morning. And as you lift your hands and as you begin to praise, out of that sacrifice, ashes come forth. What is a sacrifice? A sacrifice is a sacrifice when it costs you something. When you forgo something. The focus is never ever about the act. It's always about the motive and the intention behind the act. That's what makes it a sacrifice. We're not talking about a blood sacrifice this morning because Jesus was the ultimate blood sacrifice. He shed his blood for us, and you know, that blood of Jesus that was shed for us and the ashes that came forth from the sacrifice of his life fell on the ground, and you and I are the beauty that have come forth from the ashes of Christ's sacrifice as he laid down his life. I want to talk about a burnt offering this morning. An offering that you bring to God. It's voluntary. It's not something demanded by God. A burnt offering is a voluntary sacrifice. In Romans 12 verse 1 it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." God gives us the gift of free will. And yet we need to surrender it as a burnt offering. We need to say, "Not my will, but yours be done." And over and over and over again in our lives as we walk with God, how many times have you had to say that? How many times have you had to say, "God, this is what I want. This is what my flesh wants. But this is what your will, I want your will." Yesterday, talking to the young people and talking about relationships and the pressure that there is on young people today to either have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They can be 12 years old and they want a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And the pressure to have a relationship with something and everything inside you wants that. And I was saying how much courage it takes to say, "I'm not going to do this because I belong to Christ. I'm going to put aside these things. I'm going to lay aside what my flesh wants and what everybody else is doing, and I'm going to choose to stand for Jesus." That takes courage. And you know what? I look at the widow in Mark 12:42. The widow that Jesus singled out. It says in the verse 42, a poor widow came in and put 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. And calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put into the treasury more than any others." You see, Jesus knew what those 2 little coins cost her. They actually cost her everything. And you know that the rich who were standing around may have despised her offering, but they never knew what it cost her. And I want to say to you this morning that there are times where people may make a sacrifice that means nothing to you, because to you it may not be a sacrifice. But we cannot despise the sacrifice that another person makes because we don't know what it costs them. Jesus said to the young rich man in Matthew 19, he said, if you want, because he wanted to follow Jesus, he made a statement, "I want to follow you." And Jesus says to him, "If you want to give it all that you've got," Jesus replied, "go and sell your possessions, give everything to the poor, all your wealth, and then all of your wealth will then be in heaven, and then come and follow me." And that was the last thing that the young man expected to hear. And so, crestfallen, he walked away. He was holding on tight to a lot of things, and he couldn't bear to let them go. He could not make the sacrifice. A widow gave everything that she had, and a young man could give nothing because he wasn't prepared to make the sacrifice. And I want to say to you this morning that there are times when God speaks to you, and he offers you an opportunity. He never forces you, but he offers you an opportunity to make a sacrifice. And you either choose or you don't. And I believe this morning that there are some of you sitting in this place right now as a sacrifice that you have not given. And you've been holding on and you've been vacillating back and forth. But God is saying this morning that this message this morning may be exactly just for you. That God may be challenging you this morning to take that step of faith and to make that sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice if you give what you can afford. Did you hear what I said? I'm not speaking about money here this morning. That may be one tiny portion of what I'm saying. But it's not a sacrifice if you can give what you can afford. It is not a sacrifice unless it's given with the right purpose and the right reason. Jesus was watching how people gave. He saw the widow and he knew that she gave with the right spirit. It is a sacrifice when we give to God things that we genuinely need. It becomes a sacrifice. When we look at Paul's life, we realize that Paul gave up everything to follow Jesus. Everything that he had worked for his whole entire life, he gave up when he had an encounter with Christ. He suffered stripes, imprisonment, shipwreck, and other persecutions for the cause of Christ. And Paul said in 2 Corinthians 11, 23 to 28, he said, I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers and danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily pressure out of my concern for the churches. Paul knew what it was to sacrifice. He willingly sacrificed. Sacrifices involve the dedication, many times, of personal accomplishments to Jesus. If we just look at everyday lives of everyday people. I was in South Africa just a few weeks ago and I was ministering at my own home church, and in our home church, our pastor, who's been the pastor there for 15 years, he was a medical doctor for 25 years before he became a pastor. And God challenged him to give up his medical practice and to become a pastor of a church. And I said to him, I'm sure being a pastor was a far greater challenge than being a medical doctor. And it was. But he made a choice to sacrifice and to lay aside everything that he had to follow the cause of Christ and to follow the calling of Christ in his life. What about just everyday living? What about everyday people that make everyday choices? In Australia, as I travel around this country constantly, you know, my husband and I, we now live at Carabrand Drug and Alcohol Rehab Centre in Narrabort. My husband works there, but on weekends I still travel and minister at churches all over this country, sometimes very tiny little churches. And as I go and as I minister around this country, I see many people that have come from other nations to Australia. Australia is a land of settlers. Whoever you are this morning, unless you have Aboriginal blood in you, every single one of you, your ancestors came from somewhere. Every single one of you in this place, someone some time ago made a choice to come to this nation. And you will never ever know what it cost them to come here. You will never know the price that they paid to make a decision to get on a ship, many times to leave behind their wives and children for years, to come into this country, to begin to work and get money together, and then to send for their families and bring them over here at a tremendous cost so that you today can live the life that you live in. You will never know what it is. In South Africa recently, I was sharing about how for years and years fathers would make decisions to go and work on the mines, and they would leave their wives and their children, and many times the wives had to make a choice to go into the city to work for people so that they could put food on the plates of their children and leave their children with elderly parents to be raised by grandparents, separating themselves from their families so that their children can have a better life and have an education. And do you know what? Those young people today will never ever know the prices. They may have despised the sacrifice of their parents because they never saw their fathers and they never saw their mothers, but they'll never ever know the price that was paid for them to be where they are today. What about missions? that left this country, and I've spoken to many who made a decision to go to countries like Papua New Guinea. And in those days, if you were a missionary, you never came back to Australia for 2 years. You just didn't come back. And those missionaries that had children, they had to make decisions to send their children back to Australia. Little children had to be sent back here to stay with people in the church or family members to be educated while their parents continued to be missionaries in tribes to tribal people at great cost. Those children may have been filled with pain, filled with rejection, never understood why they were separated from their mothers and fathers. They didn't know the tears that their mothers and fathers may have shed daily. Wanting to be with their children desperately, never knew. Those children would never know the price of what their parents paid as they became missionaries in other countries. But I want to tell you today, I see the children of missionaries, and I want to tell you that 90% of them are passionately serving and love God. And many of them are missionaries themselves today. Because you see, they are the beauty that came forth from the ashes of their parents' lives. They are the beauty. No one will ever know the sacrifices that people make as they choose to follow the calling of Christ. As people choose to constantly, for years and years, pastor 20 or 30 people in some tiny little country church somewhere that nobody knows about. But one after one after one, the beauty comes forth from the ashes of the sacrifice of their lives that they may never ever know about. People that come and go, and you impart something to them.